Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for our Texas Holocaust Remembrance Week program. I'm Dr. Jessica Hanshaw, Education and Curations Manager with the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio. We will begin today's presentation with a few words from Texas State Senator Jose Menendez before introducing our speaker. As a reminder for viewers on the Zoom webinar, our Q&A and chat boxes are available throughout the presentation. If you have any questions or comments, you may enter them in these spaces.
Hi, I'm State Senator Jose Menendez, and I'd like to welcome you to Holocaust Remembrance Week of 2022. I am so pleased you're joining students from across Texas and learning about the Holocaust. I also want to say thank you to the Texas Holocaust Genocide and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission, to the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio, and to all of the partners who've made these educational resources available to schools across the whole state of Texas. In 2019, State Representative Richard Raymond and I collaborated to pass Senate Bill 1828. The bill calls on the governor of the state to designate a Holocaust Remembrance Week in order to educate students about the Holocaust and inspire a sense of responsibility to recognize and uphold human value that helps prevent future atrocities. The bill passed both the House and Senate unanimously. That tells you how important this effort is to all of us. Senate Bill 1828 was made possible because of the persistence of local upstanders who call themselves the Four Ladies in a Car, because of their frequent trips to Austin on a mission to have a state-designated Holocaust Remembrance Week in Texas. They understand that it is a solemn duty to remember the Holocaust and to foster communities of awareness, care, and kindness. You're going to learn the stories of survivors of the Holocaust and about the upstanders whose compassionate actions saved many lives. You too can be heroes by speaking up whenever you witness injustice around you, or create change by working with your neighbors and local leaders to improve your community. I invite you to continue learning year-round about the heroic acts of upstanding. And just like the Four Ladies in a Car, please reach out to your elected officials in order to make a difference. You're always welcome to reach out to me at 210-733-6604. And I want to thank you for joining me today. And I hope you share everything you learned throughout this observation of the Holocaust Remembrance Week with everyone you meet. Have a great day.
Hello, I'm Lisa Berry. I am the 2018 Maxine Cohen Hope for Humanity Educator Award recipient. And today I'm very pleased to introduce to you a very special guest speaker, Christopher Anderson. Christopher Anderson works extensively in understanding and building relationships with people and places. He has a long career in agribusiness, commencing with a bachelor's in management from Binghamton University. He helped farm families in succession and tax planning, and currently has his own business focused on the valuation of farms and rural industrial properties. After the death of a family member in the attacks of 9/11/2001, Chris was compelled to duty and service for his country as an Army Reserve chaplain. During the peaks of the Iraq and Afghanistan operations, he helped service members and families to find meaning and peace in the struggles and storms that come with military service. Chris also served as a civilian pastor with a Master of Divinity from Clark's Summit University, working in rural churches to try to make a difference in those oft-forgotten communities. At the intersection of his experiences with people, place, and trauma, Chris earned a graduate certificate in Geographic Information Science, GI Science, from the University of Southern California, and is pursuing his PhD in GI Science from Texas State University, applying GI Science in Holocaust studies and understanding the instance of rescue during the Holocaust. His goal is helping contemporary societies learn lessons of courage and resiliency through research and technology-based interactions. I give you Christopher Anderson.
This time, go ahead and welcome Chris Anderson to our presentation today. Thank you very much for being here, and I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction, Lisa, and thank you, Senator. At this point, I'll share my screen. Okay, the title of our presentation this morning is Geography of the Holocaust Rescuer, and I'd also like to acknowledge my advisor at Texas State, Dr. Giordano, and thank you for his assistance. Okay, so Holocaust geographies, I guess the Holocaust occurred in thousands of different places, but only relatively recently has the Holocaust been studied from a specifically geographical perspective. Often in Holocaust studies, we talk about the three categories of perpetrators, victims, and bystanders. And the research has, well, first it was focused on not exclusively, but rather heavily on perpetrators, and that there's been a correction of that, thankfully, in terms of looking more at the victims and their experiences. But bystanders still are not as studied as the first two, and rescuers as a category, a subcategory of bystanders, are probably even less studied, and certainly from a geographical perspective, even less beyond that. So what is a Holocaust rescuer? Well, quite simply, it's a person who helped Jewish people during the Holocaust in giving shelter, food, transport, papers to escape, to give them any kind of aid. Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, which is Israel's Holocaust Museum and Research Institution, their memorial, they had criteria to their definition of a Holocaust rescuer for their specific recognition. And they add those criteria of active involvement of the rescuer in saving Jewish people from the threat of death or deportation, that there was a risk to the rescuer's life, liberty, or position, that their initial motivation was simply to help Jewish people and not for money, not for religious conversion, not for adoption of a child, and that also there was testimony which documented that rescue activity. So who was a Holocaust rescuer? Well, there was individuals, of course, who acted alone. One example of that is Aristides de Sousa Menendez. He actually was the subject of an article in the Smithsonian magazine in November of 2021. He was a diplomat stationed in France who helped through paperwork and actually quite active involvement and even getting folks across the border, of giving Jewish people the ability to escape France in 1940. Shortly after the Nazi invasion and the French surrender, and helped them to get to Portugal, and eventually, many from there went to different places around the world. And for his efforts, his country thanked him by essentially stripping him of his, of his position, of his wealth, he's basically was suffering for the rest of his life because of his actions. If you get a chance to read the Smithsonian in November 2021, it's a great article, very accessible for all ages. There were local groups who were involved in rescue. The Żegota in Warsaw was the Council to Aid the Jews, and it was founded in response to the deportations when they began in the Warsaw Ghetto. And then there was another example would be the group on the Plateau Vivre Lignon in France, who, as we'll see shortly, were involved in potentially rescuing upwards of thousands of Jewish people. There were regional networks. One example would be the Jewish organized networks in France. We don't want to forget that Jewish people themselves were rescuers. We often focus on the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people who were rescuers, but Jewish people had agency. In other words, they were active in their own rescue and the rescue of fellow Jewish people. And then there were national efforts, like in Denmark, in Bulgaria, where there was, across those two nations in particular, there was concerted efforts to preserve the Jewish people that were in those countries. And then there was some international efforts, like the Quakers, for example, who had locations across Europe, across Nazi-occupied Europe, in different ways that they helped. And so all these different definitions of who was a Holocaust rescue. So you can see it's rather broad. Where did rescue occur? Well, quite simply, everywhere. Everywhere that the Holocaust occurred, rescue was occurring in the countryside, in small little towns, in the largest cities, in hidden rooms, for example. I mean, we think of the hidden rooms, we often think of Anne Frank. In basements and barns and forests and homes and factories. And we think of factories, we think of Oskar Schindler, we think of Schindler's List. The question that I guess, my research is trying to ask, which is still very much, in its initial stages, is were some places more likely to be involved in rescue? Were there certain factors geographically that may have encouraged rescue? Or is there patterns that we can see by location where rescue was more likely to occur? And so we're going to dive into that a little bit, but as I said, the research it's kind of in its initial stages, but it gives us something to think about in terms of how that occurred. Understanding Holocaust rescue is rather complex because it happened at many different times and places and all kinds of people that were involved. Rescue wasn't just some singular thing. It was, like we saw before, what was rescue? It was, giving food, it was giving shelter, it was giving paperwork, it was, just helping somebody to physically move place to place. So it wasn't some singular thing that's very easy to define, but rather it was a very broad-based activity. And there was also very diverse reasons why people became rescuers. So it isn't, again, a single motivation either. It was very diverse. So why did someone become a rescuer? Well, in some cases it was friendship. It was someone that they knew. It was an acquaintance or perhaps a close friend that they knew before the war, and they were interested in helping them. It could have been religious or personal conviction. They just felt that this was something that they had to do. And related to that would be the sense of altruism, this sense of doing good, of trying to, just be a force for good, if you will. Group involvement. So if they were part of a group that was involved in rescue, and their peers in that group, whether it was a religious group or whatever it may have been, if they were involved in rescue, perhaps there was some pressure or some social expectations. There was a social network, if you will, involved in rescue, and so that might have made it more likely for that person to become a rescuer themselves. For some folks, there was a history of being persecuted themselves, either them individually or perhaps their people group that they belonged to, whether it was their ethnic group or their religious group. So they were, they understood what persecution was. Some were not particularly pro-Jewish or, necessarily pro-rescue even, but if they were so, let's say, vehemently anti-Nazi that anything that they could do to thwart the Nazi agenda, they would do, just simply because, of their, let's just say, opposition to the Nazi regime. And for some, it was money. Yad Vashem will only recognize, from a commendation standpoint, those that did not do it for money, but some did. And so that is the reality, that some did, accept payment or other things that allowed them to be financially paid or in goods or services to help a Jewish person to become to be rescued. Okay, so for the remainder of the presentation, we're going to look at a case study, and we saw this location just a little bit ago in one of the previous slides, and it's the Plateau Vivarais-Lignon in France. And there's a village that's at the heart of the plateau. It's at the heart of the rescue operation, and oftentimes is the one that's when people think of this place, they think of this little village, Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. But essentially, it was the entire plateau that was involved in the rescue effort. And you can see from the map here on the screen that it's in the south central part of France. Paris is up here, the Alps are here, the Mediterranean and Marseille is there. So this, it's in a, let's just say, an out of the way place, which we'll dive into a little bit more. And we're also going to watch 3 short clips from Weapons of the Spirit by Pierre Sauvage, who is a Holocaust survivor and at the Chambon Foundation. And he's actually in the process of updating this video. He made the video a few decades ago, and he's in the process of revamping it. But it's it's like 90 minutes long total, but we're just going to look at a couple minutes clips of each parts of this video. So this is the first clip. All right, well, some folks are saying that there's no sound on the video. Unfortunately, that it did work in our trial run, so I apologize for that. So I guess we'll plow forward without the video. Essentially, he goes back to Le Chambon, and he interviews some people that were involved in the rescue efforts that essentially saved himself and his family, well, his mom, his mother, and himself. And he's trying to understand how was it that he benefited by these people's willingness to do what they did. And so he made this back in the 1970s, which was, as he even says himself, fortuitous timing. It was good timing because many of these folks, by this point have long passed away. And so he goes and he interviews some of the key people, including those that he stayed with himself, when he was just a baby. And he's obviously growing up, he was born in Poland, but having grown up in France, he speaks fluent French. And so he has a very close connection, both linguistically and just personally, with these folks. So the first group of people he talks to is the people that actually sheltered him and his family. And one of the things they said was that we were used to it, in terms of so he was asking why did you do this? And one of the ladies says, well, this is something we were used to. So let's go forward. So he's in this, let's just put it this way. Let's just say, we'll make some educated guesses here. So for those of you out in for the folks out in the audience, for the students, I guess I want to just kind of make this a little bit more interactive. Unfortunately, we're on Zoom and not live, and it would be much easier to do live. But if folks could put it in the chat or the Q&A, where do you think that the Jewish people came from that went to Le Chambon and the plateau? Do you think it was maybe just France? I mean, any thoughts that anybody would make some guesses? Yes, exactly. So Nancy Iserman, who that's probably monitoring that chat on her side, the answer is they came from all over Europe, and that's true. They came from Eastern Europe and from Western Europe and Central Europe, and they came in onesies and twosies at first, very small numbers, and then as word started to spread, it became, and potentially thousands, upwards of 5,000 is the one estimate. That might be a little high based on some of the more recent research, but okay, why did they come to this particular location? Now, unfortunately, you didn't get to see the video, but does it look like, we saw the countryside there? Does it look like a big city? Does it look like like it's in the middle of all the activity happening? I mean, what did it, from the little bit of the video that you saw, what did this place look like? And why would they come here? Anybody want to make a guess? Yes, it was more secluded. So this was a place that, like we saw in the map, that was not at the heart of everything. It was a rather rural place. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only places, again, that rescue occurred. But in this case, it probably was important, although the research is still to say that is that the reason. Again, what kind of place is this? As we said, it's rural. It's a place of well, I'm gonna let that question ride a little bit until later, and we'll get into it. What kind of risks do you think that the rescuers faced for the students out there? Yep, being killed. That was a risk. This was not, let's just say, this was not Poland. Poland, the Nazis were much more, let's just say, severe in their penalties for helping Jewish people, but that doesn't mean that they weren't severe in France, but it was a matter of degrees. In other words, relatively speaking, the Nazi enforcement of the way that they would treat somebody who was caught helping a Jewish person was typically much more severe in Poland and parts of Eastern Europe than it was in France. And it was partially because of just how France was administered and just differing aspects of how policy was instituted differently in different places. And yes, some were sent to the concentration camps, which the video would show, one of the later videos, but unfortunately we don't get to see that. But and why did the people of Le Chambon help? So remember, I said the one lady that he actually stayed with, she made this comment that we were used to it. So what does she think she means by that? Well, there's a unique history of this plateau. And it had been a safe haven for the Huguenots for centuries. And the Huguenots were a religious minority that, had, since the 1600s and before, had experienced some rather severe persecution in France. Many had been killed and discriminated against. And so they they found this little plateau, in the last 400 years before this, as a place that they could find safety and that they were left alone. But that cultural memory, if you will, was still very much alive for the people of the plateau. And so, when she said, well, we were used to it, when Pierre asked her, why did you help this Jewish family? Why did you allow them to stay with you? Why did you put yourself at risk? That was her response. And so suffering under religious persecution was a part of their identity in this particular place. And so the question is, this is an open question for those out in listening, is why did this matter? You think, what is it about having been a victim of persecution yourself? Why would that matter when someone comes along who needs help, who is also suffering persecution? What is it about that prior experience that perhaps encourages someone to be more likely to help? Anybody got any thoughts? Empathy. Perfect. That was the word I was looking for. So somebody gets a gold star on that one. This sense of empathy. In other words, I always define it like the ability to walk in someone else's shoes. And if you've walked in those shoes yourself, even if it was your ancestors, hundreds of years before, in today's TV world and internet world and all of that, and very interconnected world, we seem to forget, I think, how important cultural memory was in terms of what was passed down generation to generation to generation. That history was very important in times past, in that sense of like, my ancestors went through this, so therefore, that means something to me. And in our world, it's everything is so very fast and now and in the moment. And I think we tend to forget about the importance of our although ancestry.com, I guess, is a big thing right now, and genealogy and the search for our roots. Maybe people are realizing just how important that is, but nonetheless, they were very connected to their roots. So this sense of empathy was important. And so there's another video. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to watch it because we don't have
Chris,
sound.
will you check on your share screen? Will you check that you're sharing your sound? So if you find the toolbar and go to share screen.
Let's see. Where would the share screen, where would the actual options and stuff be, I guess?
So wherever you have your remote controls, so the one that has the chat box and all of that for you to click on, there's the share screen, and they'll give you the option to do a new share. Yep. And just check that you have share sound clicked.
Okay, so no, that was not clicked.
And now, now we can try it again.
All right. Okay. Sorry about that.
Magda Trocmé, widow of the pastor of Le Chambon during the war.
Chacun a agi selon ce qu'il croyait devoir faire dans la journée. On me demande souvent quelle était votre organisation. Mais s'il y avait une organisation, ça aurait été raté, voyons. On ne va pas écrire sur des petits papiers, aujourd'hui on fera ça, demain on fera ça. À mesure que les difficultés se présentaient, chacun dans son coin faisait ce qu'il croyait. Nous ne savions pas tout ce qui se passait dans les maisons. Et les gens ne savaient pas ce que nous faisions. Sûr, mon mari a eu une grande influence, ça c'est sûr. Mais ça ne veut pas dire qu'il était au courant de tout. C'était un consensus général.
Un dimanche où nous nous trouvions au culte à Tens, le pasteur est venu taper à la porte et il a dit « 3 Anciens Testaments sont arrivés ». Et nous savions que les Anciens Testaments, c'était des Juifs. Et un vieux frère s'est levé, un vieux chrétien, et il a dit « Je les prends ». Et les a emmenés chez lui dans une ferme au milieu des prés et les a cachés.
Among the most welcoming to the Jews were the area's independent Protestants, who did not recognize the authority of the clergy and sought to live, as best they could, according to Scripture. 1/3 of the population belonged to these groups, including Marie Brotte.
Pour vous, c'était des êtres humains, ces juifs qui vous demandaient de l'aide, mais
Ah,
c'était
oui.
également des juifs.
Mais c'était des juifs, évidemment.
Et
C'était
cela
des
était
Juifs.
important.
Oui, c'était très important. Et même s'ils n'acceptaient peut-être pas vraiment l'évangile, ça c'est sûr, ils restaient peut-être bien juifs ou peut-être pas grand-chose, eh bien nous le faisions quand même, parce que c'était le peuple de Dieu. C'était ça qui comptait.
Marie and Léon Brotte themselves found food and shelter for a stream of refugees.
Votre mange et bois et rassasie-toi. Si tu ne donnes rien à ton frère, bien, tu es un pauvre malheureux. Du reste, tu aimeras ton prochain comme toi-même, le prochain est dans la rue. Ne faisons pas comme le prêtre, le sacrificateur qui a passé outre et qui a laissé l'homme qui était tombé entre les mains des voleurs. Voilà. Et vraiment, le juif était entre les mains des voleurs.
Okay, so questions for folks. Thank you for helping with the sound problem. I apologize for not having that checked before. How much were the people of the plateau part of the mainstream in French society? It's kind of a rhetorical question. I think, as we can see, they weren't, right? So what was more important to the rescuers than following the crowd and ensuring their own safety? What was more important to them than just doing what everyone else was doing and being safe? Does somebody want to give us a thought on that? Yes, for them, doing what they would define as the gospel, what the gospel said to them, which was helping and helping, loving your neighbor and just and also for their particular brand of Christianity, they very much took literally, as they would call it, the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, in terms of the Jewish people being the people of God. And so for them, that was very important. And so they felt compelled by their faith to help them because of, of that, the implications of that. So then the question, how did the social circles of the people of the plateau influence the rescue efforts? And there was a couple little comments that the people he interviewed made. So what was the social circle? It was their church. So how did that influence the rescue efforts? Did anybody catch that in the video? Okay, so basically the pastor, the leader of their little social network, was and there was several churches all over the plateau involved. It was various pastors who were spearheading the effort and saying, the one lady says there was an Old Testament that needs, that just came. And so that was their way of saying, that there was a Jewish person who needed help. And so then, that pastor was looking for that person or somebody in the church to help them. So that social network was very important. And then the question which we're going to, what we're going to do or going to look at is, how did the people of the plateau manage to be successful in helping Jewish people? So what was different about this place, about the plateau and about Le Chambon? And so I want to look at it from a few different ways. Well, what was different physically in terms of, by physical topography, we're talking about mountains and plains and hills and rivers and oceans. And, so that, that sense of what was different about the landscape. And so here's a map, and it's rather stark in its colors, but that's on purpose. So the white is the ocean, or the Mediterranean. The blue is very flat areas. The red is the Alps, and then the greens and the yellows and the the lighter reds are hills and mountains, other mountains besides the Alps. And so the plateau is right there. So I guess question, what's different? Well, it's in a very hilly, hard to reach place, and again, Paris is up in here. Lyon is over in here. Marseille is down here, and there's the Loire Valley is here. But this area it's called the Central Massif in France, and it's it's not in the heart of economic activity or it's just hard to get to. What was different in terms of religious minority? So I looked at, and this map measures what percentage of the population in France was Protestant. And so the more red, the more Protestant it was. And so France has historically been mostly Roman Catholic. And so you can see most of France is yellow. Now there's a couple of white areas, and this is just because of those departments didn't exist back, when this occurred. And France has created a couple different departments around Paris. But in any case, the plateau is here. So you can see it's at the higher end of the extreme in terms of being different religiously than the rest of France. Other demographics, what else is different? Well, first of all, what's demographics? For those of you that may not know, it's the study of a population based on all kinds of potentially different things. And so I analyzed the areas of France called departments based on 6 different measures. So one of them is the percent of the population that was rural. And I was looking for areas that had a high percentage of the population that was rural. And by rural, I mean countryside, not city. The second part is I looked at the percent of the population that was born outside of the department. And again, department's just an area of France. And then the next 2 are very similar. Percentage of the population that was born outside of France, and then the percentage of the population that had foreign citizenship. So I was looking for areas that had low percentages of number 2, 3, and 4. And you think about, well, what would that mean? Well, if you don't have a lot of people coming into the area, either from outside of the department or outside of France or with foreign citizenship, that essentially means that those areas don't have a lot of influx of new people. Now, in San Antonio and Austin, particularly in Austin, there's a lot of new people coming in, right? So that percentage would be high in Austin because there's a lot of folks coming into Austin, as opposed to areas, let's say in, parts of, where I'm from, upstate New York, where there's very little people coming into the area for a lot of reasons, economic and other. So that would be low. So I was looking like, okay, what parts of France were low in this measure? And that would say that they're isolated populations because there's not a lot of people moving into that area. Number 5 would be the percentage of the population that was employed in commercial occupations. And I was looking for areas that were low on this measure, but that would seem to indicate that there was a low amount of commercial occupations, i.e. relation to business and economic activity. So there's not a lot of commercial activity going on. And then last would be areas with a low total population. So I was looking for areas that had, very few people. So then I get all of those 6 and I had maps for each of them. And then I said, all right, which departments in France, which areas in France were different from the rest of France on all 6 of those measures? And again, basically we wanted ones that were high rural percentage and low amount of people coming in, low amount of business activity, low total population. Okay, and then the results was this. And I'm going to take it over here and blow up the map. Oh, it didn't go back. All right. So the plateau is in the only department in France that met all 6 of those of those measures. So the Haute-Loire was the only department in France that passed the test, if you will, of being low on all of those measures, or in the case of rural, high. So, and the plateau is right in the heart of that department. So what it would seem to indicate is that, you know, if you look at demographically these different measures, the plateau was very different in terms of being rural and not a lot of people coming in. It was not a lot of business activity, low total population. And I also looked at economics in a different way, and I looked at what percentage of the population was employed as managers or executives of companies of more than 10 people. Now, this data is more recent because I couldn't get data from 1940, but here's the data. Now that is the small map, so I blew this up. The plateau is this little pink area because it was off the scale in terms of, it was below the scale of the departments. So the departments range from about 5 to 20, over 26% were involved in, you know, these important positions. The plateau only had 2.8% involved in those, let's just say, economically powerful positions, executives and managers and so forth. So it would seem to indicate that this place didn't have a lot of connection to economically powerful people. So how did the people of the plateau manage to be successful in helping Jewish people? Because perhaps it was remote. How was it remote? Well, it was remote topographically in terms of, again, landscape. It was a remote place because it was in those, that, you know, in that plateau. It was hard to get to. It was, you know, you had to go up the mountains to get to it. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't out in the plains of the rest of France. It wasn't in a place that was along major trade routes. It wasn't along, there was a little train line, but it wasn't along, you know, major railroad routes or canal routes or anything else. It was isolated physically. It also was remote in terms of its population makeup. It was a, you know, had a high percentage of this, you know, religious minority that had suffered persecution. It was rural with a very small population. It was very few people came in or out of the area. It was isolated. There was very little commercial activity, and it was not connected to these economic sources of power in France. You know, by that, I mean, in terms of those executives and the managers, there was very, very few of that kind of activity in this place. Okay, there's one more video.
And yet, here, under the Nazi occupation, Jewish religious services were held during the High Holy Days and Hanukkah, with the help of devout Christians. Plague did reach into Le Chambon one summer morning in 1943. The Gestapo arrived undetected at this home for older male students that had been set up under American Christian supervision. Here, before the Nazi raid, some young men had actually pursued graduate studies. But on that day, 24 youths were beaten and deported. Deported with them was the pastor's cousin, Daniel Trocmé, who had been running both this home and Le Grillon, the American-funded home for young children. He had been warned that he was a target for a raid and that he should go into hiding. But Daniel Trocmé had not come to Le Chambon to hide. He had no interest in religious dogma and great wariness about all narrow religious beliefs. But the work going on in Le Chambon meant something to him, as he had explained to his parents in a letter written less than a year before his arrest. I think it may be time for me to assume responsibilities with regard to other people. Le Chambon is something of a contribution to the reconstruction of our world. The future will tell me whether I was equal to the task or not, and it will tell only me, because it is not a matter of success in the eyes of the world. I have chosen Le Chambon because I will thus be able not to be ashamed of myself. Daniel Trocmé died on April 2nd, 1944, in Majdanek extermination camp. To the end, his murderers found it difficult to believe that he wasn't a Jew.
Okay, so religion wasn't the only motivator, was it? Any thoughts? I know we're just in our last minute or two here. What were some other motivations for rescue in Le Chambon? Daniel Truckmay was an example of somebody who was not there because of religion. You know, why was he there to help? Anybody have any thoughts? Exactly, simply just to do the right thing in his eyes, in his view. You know, for him, he had to be there. And what price was paid? It mentioned it in terms of Daniel Truckmay. Did anybody catch what happened to Daniel? Right, he was killed. So yes, he was captured. There was a Gestapo raid, and he and the residents of the school that he was leading were deported and well, arrested and deported, and then he died at in the concentration camp. So so there's a quote that Daniel made in his letter to his family, that he was ready to assume responsibilities with regard to other people. How did he do that in particular? Any thoughts? Yes, he stayed to help them. He did not run away. Even by coming to the Chambon, he made a choice. Right, exactly. The next answer, he ran a school where Jews could get training and education during the war. So, and somebody answered earlier in terms of his belief in, you know, universalism and just, you know, just humanism. And it was his way, exactly. Another said it was his way to help correct the wrong. It was his way, he said, to contribute toward a rebuilding of this world. So it was very important, this work, to him, and it was a way that as he said, that he could be able not to be ashamed of myself, is what he said in his letter. So I guess the next couple questions I don't want you to answer, but I want you to think about: how do we choose to live to be able not to be ashamed of ourselves? And then, can we be a rescuer, a helper to someone who is facing persecution or discrimination or hatred in our schools and communities and beyond? And then, are we willing to pay a price to be that helper? And so I'll leave you to those questions, and I thank you for your attention. I apologize for the technological difficulties. I wish we were all in person. I wish I could see everyone's faces and we could interact and talk and dialogue and really dive into this, but you know, this is the best we can do, and I totally understand that and support that. But I you know, maybe someday we'll meet together. So thank you for your time and attention, and I appreciate the interaction even over Zoom. So thank you very much.
Again, we want to thank Chris Anderson for being with us today and for participating in our Remembrance Week programming. We also want to thank our sponsors for their generous contributions to this programming, including the Texas Holocaust Genocide and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission. And finally, we'd like to thank our viewers for joining us today. To learn more information about Texas Holocaust Remembrance Week, or to find any of our presentations from this week, you can visit our website at hmmsa.org/THRW. And we also ask that you consider filling out a post-event survey on our website after viewing this presentation. Again, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Chris, for joining us today.